So last I left off, I haven't spoken to my dad in over a decade. I think the last time I spoke to him was in 2013. I don't need him in my kids' lives. He disowned me a long time ago, or I felt he disowned me, even though I felt like he wanted to communicate with me, but he didn't want to own up to the fact that he has half Black grandchildren. I'm off somewhere studying. The kids didn't exist. There was no pictures of me in this house. There's no pictures of the kids in this house. Anytime I would see one of his friends, oh, how's school? Bro, I'm married. But anyways, yeah, I don't need that in my life. You'll learn more about my upbringing with my dad and my stepmother in another video. There's a lot there. Anyway, so now let's get into my mom. I tried. Guys, I tried. And I'm like, okay, let's see if she changed. And I would use little triggers to see how she would react. There were 3 things that I'm like, wow, you can still do this to this day? So one was my 21-year-old hurt his Achilles in December. He got hurt. I told Instagram, Facebook, all of that. So my mom follows me on Facebook. So she read it. And I also told my sister, who told my mom. My mom writes me 4 days after it happened. And she was like, she wrote me on Facebook Messenger. She's like, is, Elijah okay? I was like, he's okay. He's in a lot of pain. She wrote me 2 days after that message and gave me a thumbs up emoji. A thumbs up. Okay, whatever. So I decided to visit my sister in Maryland, and because she just had a baby and I wanted to see my nieces. There's 2 of them. So I went there with my oldest daughter, who was her favorite when I was younger. She was literally like, give me her and I want to raise her again like she was her daughter, because apparently she didn't raise me and my sister right. Yeah. Anyways, so I brought her to Maryland to see her grandmother because she also wanted to see her uncle and her aunt and all of that good stuff. And my mom, the only thing she really said to my daughter was hi. There was no conversation. There was no, oh, how's school? Or what are you doing? Are you working? There was no trying to get to know her granddaughter at all. And I'm like, that's crazy. You would think she wants to get to know her grandchild. Like, who wouldn't want to get to know your grandchild? If I had a grandchild, I want to know everything about that child. But yeah, she really wasn't trying to talk to that child. And it was very disheartening to see. Very disheartening. I'm like, wow, okay. I'm going to have to get to a part 2 because there's not enough room in this video for that.
What does it reveal about our collective psyche when we witness families rejecting their own flesh and blood for crossing invisible cultural boundaries? Let me share with you what I've observed across decades of studying cultural identity conflicts. The phenomenon of parents disowning children for marrying outside their ethnic group represents not merely personal prejudice, but a confrontation with what Jung would call the cultural shadow, the disowned aspects of collective identity that threaten the ego structure of the group. Consider the story of Priya, whose Indian parents refused to acknowledge her children because their father was Black. For 10 years, an entire decade, her father maintained this separation. I haven't spoken to my dad in over a decade, she tells us. He disowned me a long time ago. But what is really being disowned here? Is it truly the daughter, or is it the father's own fear of cultural dissolution? His terror at facing the shadow aspects of his cultural conditioning? The shadow grows more powerful in proportion to how vigorously we deny it. Those cultures with the most rigid boundaries often harbor the deepest wells of unacknowledged prejudice. This is not unique. To Indian culture, we see similar patterns across Japanese, Chinese, European, and Middle Eastern traditions. The archetype of purity, so central to many cultural identities, finds expression through rejection of the other, a psychological mechanism Jung identified as fundamental to human tribalism. He would tell people, I'm off somewhere studying. Priya continues, the kids didn't exist. There's no pictures of me in this house. There's no pictures of the kids in this house. This erasure represents the maintenance of the cultural persona, the mask we present to others that conforms to collective expectations. The grandfather's refusal to acknowledge his grandchildren's existence is not merely personal rejection, but the defense of a cultural persona that cannot integrate what Jung would call the transcendent function, the natural evolution of consciousness that occurs when opposing forces are allowed to meet and transform one another. Within traditional structures, the individual is expected to subordinate their personal development to collective norms. One woman describes her arranged marriage. "I had never met him before my marriage was arranged. This guy used to live abroad, and one day my parents called me and said they found me a husband." When asked if she loves her husband after 6 years of marriage, the sadness in her eyes reveals the price paid for maintaining cultural continuity at the expense of individual wholeness. Jung would identify this as the sacrifice of the individual self on the altar of cultural continuity, a pattern that may preserve cultural identity across generations, but at tremendous psychological cost. The archetype of the self, our innate drive toward wholeness and integration, comes into direct conflict with the cultural complex that demands conformity. Colorism permeates South Asian culture, one woman explains. "We love whiteness, and I mean both in terms of skin, but also in terms of our internalization of white supremacy and racism." What Jung would recognize here is a cultural complex, an emotionally charged group of ideas that has become autonomous within the collective psyche. Colorism functions not merely as prejudice, but as an archetypal pattern that has been energized through historical trauma and colonial conditioning. The British colonization of India lasted nearly 200 years, during which lighter skin became associated with power, privilege, and social mobility. But as one commentator notes, they left 75 years ago, and we're still holding on to one of the biggest legacies they've left behind: fair skin privilege and colorism. This persistence reveals what Jung called the autonomy of the complex, how psychological patterns can continue to operate independently of conscious intention across generations, long after the original conditions that created them have disappeared. The colonizer physically leaves, but psychologically remains present in the cultural unconscious. Consider the child who visited a friend's home for dance practice. Her whole family basically wouldn't acknowledge me, and they would only serve me food on a metal tray, and they wouldn't let their kids touch that metal tray. The association between darker skin and ritual impurity represents the shadow aspect of the caste system, a structural manifestation of what Jung would call the collective unconscious, organizing itself around archetypal patterns of hierarchy. When individuals from different cultural backgrounds form intimate relationships, they engage not just with each other as individuals, but with the collective anima-animus projections of their respective cultures. The anima represents the feminine archetype in the male unconscious, while the animus represents the masculine archetype in the female unconscious. In traditional cultures, these projections are typically contained within culturally approved relationships. When someone marries outside their culture, they disrupt not only social norms, but the collectively managed archetypal projections that maintain cultural boundaries. Indian women are leaving their whole children to be with black men, one commentator observes with apparent shock. This statement reveals the underlying fear that women, traditionally the bearers and transmitters of culture, might follow individual desire rather than collective mandate. From a Jungian perspective, such cross-cultural relationships represent not merely social transgression, but a reimagining of the anima-animus relationship outside collectively sanctioned channels. This threatens the cultural ego because it suggests autonomy from collective consciousness, what Jung would see as the emergence of individual consciousness from undifferentiated group identity. The collective responds with rejection precisely because such relationships represent psychological individuation from the group mind. Bollywood is so popular, but the representation in those movies is so problematic. One woman explains, "There are people in my comment section who are foreigners, non-South Asians, who tell me that they did not know that Indians like me existed, meaning Indians of my skin tone or darker than me. Media representations function as contemporary carriers of archetypal images. When an entire spectrum of human appearance is excluded from these images, it represents not merely aesthetic preference, but the collective repression of aspects of the cultural self." Jung recognized that wholeness requires the integration of all aspects of the psyche. A culture that systematically excludes certain physical appearances from its self-representation is engaged in a form of collective dissociation, cutting off aspects of its wholeness in service to a narrowed ideal. "I'd never knew that there were Indians who had darker skin tones than the ones that were portrayed in Bollywood movies," one viewer confesses. This ignorance is not accidental, but the product of systematic exclusion that maintains certain archetypal idealizations at the expense of psychological wholeness. The most fundamental tension revealed in these stories is between individuation, Jung's term for the process of becoming psychologically whole, and cultural conformity. When Priya chooses to marry whom she loves despite family disapproval, she prioritizes her individual journey over collective expectation. The collective response, rejection, erasure, dishonoring, reveals the threat that individual consciousness poses to collective identity. From a Jungian perspective, both positions contain partial truths. Cultures do require continuity to survive, but consciousness naturally evolves toward greater integration and wholeness. The arranged marriage story illustrates this tension. There is basically nothing I can do because I need to be with this man. I need to respect my parents' wishes because that's like a family honor. The individual is asked to sacrifice personal wholeness for collective continuity. Jung would recognize this as the sacrifice of individuation on the altar of cultural preservation, yet Jung also warned against uncritical rejection of tradition. Individuals who completely sever cultural roots risk psychological inflation and alienation from the collective unconscious that nourishes all psychic life. The challenge is not to reject culture, but to transform it through conscious relationship with its shadow aspects. How might we move beyond these painful polarizations? Jung offered the concept of the transcendent function, the psyche's natural tendency to produce unifying symbols that transcend opposites. This function emerges not through rejection of either position, but through conscious suffering of the tension between them. When the woman says, "In order to be in a magazine, you need to look lighter," she identifies the painful reality of current conditions. Yet rather than merely accepting or rejecting this condition, Jungian psychology would invite us to hold the tension between cultural reality and emerging consciousness until a third position, neither mere acceptance nor simple rejection, can emerge. This third position might manifest as new cultural forms that honor tradition while allowing for evolution, media representations that embrace the full spectrum of human appearance, or family structures that maintain cultural continuity while respecting individual choice. We need to be intentional about this because racism has been with us for a long, long time, and it's been internalized and exacerbated by people's cultures, traditions, and beliefs. One commentator observes, "This recognition of the shadow, both individual and collective, represents the beginning of integration." Jung emphasized that shadow work begins with recognizing projections. When someone claims, "I don't see color, I see love," they deny the reality of collective shadow projections that continue to operate regardless of individual intention. As one speaker forcefully argues, we need to start seeing color because only when we start seeing color will everyone else understand that they've been discriminating against us because of our skin color. This represents the Jungian insight that consciousness begins with seeing what is, not what we wish were true. Shadow integration requires first acknowledging the shadow's existence and operation in our individual and collective lives. It will be a big issue for me and my family because they're going to disown me, and it will be like I'll be dishonoring my family, the woman in an arranged marriage explains. The honor-shame dynamic represents one of the oldest archetypal patterns governing human social interaction. In traditional cultures, individual identity remains largely embedded in collective identity. Actions that bring shame to the family threaten not merely social standing, but ontological security, the sense of having a stable place in the cosmic order. The threat of being dishonored or even killed for transgressing cultural boundaries reveals how powerful these archetypal patterns remain. Jung would recognize this as the tension between older, collective forms of consciousness and the relatively recent emergence of individual consciousness as the primary locus of identity. Neither position represents absolute truth. Both contain partial wisdom that the other needs for wholeness. The path toward healing these cultural and personal wounds lies not in rejection, but integration. Jung's concept of individuation involves differentiating from collective identity without rejecting it, recognizing cultural conditioning while developing the capacity to relate to it consciously rather than being unconsciously determined by For the grandmother who barely speaks to her granddaughter, this might mean acknowledging her cultural conditioning while recognizing the child as an individual deserving of relationship regardless of ancestry. For media creators, it means expanding representations to include the full spectrum of human appearance within each culture. For individuals navigating cross-cultural relationships, it means neither rejecting cultural identity nor being imprisoned by it. We need to acknowledge the fact that racism exists and people see color, one speaker insists. This acknowledgement represents the beginning of shadow integration, seeing what is rather than what we wish were true. Only by acknowledging these patterns can we begin to transform them. Don't you have self-worth? Don't you know that you are the source? Don't you know that your skin is beautiful? Why are you looking for validation from other cultures? One commentator asks forcefully. These questions point toward what Jung would identify as the reclamation of projected value. When individuals seek validation from cultures that systematically devalue them, they participate in their own devaluation. The return of projected value begins with recognizing one's inherent worth independent of cultural validation. Yet Jung would caution against overcompensation through rejection. Those who react against cultural devaluation by completely rejecting the culture may find themselves cut off from valuable aspects of their heritage. The goal is neither submission to cultural devaluation nor reactive rejection, but conscious relationship with cultural complexes. Someone tells you that they don't like you, they don't want you, they don't love you because of the way you look, because of your skin color, and you keep going back to them. Are you desperate? The commentator asks with evident frustration. This question reveals the painful reality of internalized cultural complexes. When individuals continue seeking acceptance from groups that systematically reject them, they reenact early patterns of seeking validation from rejecting authority figures. Breaking this pattern requires what Jung called psychological birth, the development of inner authority independent of collective validation. Yet Jung would also recognize that wholesale rejection of one's cultural roots carries its own psychological dangers. Those who completely reject their heritage risk losing connection to the collective unconscious that nourishes all psychic life. The challenge is developing conscious relationship with cultural heritage rather than either unconscious submission or wholesale rejection. The fundamental call in all these stories is toward greater consciousness, seeing clearly both individual and collective patterns without being determined by them. Whether through media representation, family relationships, or intimate partnerships, the invitation is to recognize conditioning without being imprisoned by it. Jung believed that consciousness evolves not through rejection of the past, but through integration of it. The cultural shadows revealed in these stories, colorism, caste prejudice, rejection of mixed-race children, represent not merely social problems, but opportunities for collective shadow integration. When the speaker says, "We need to be intentional about how we date, with who we lay with who we make our offsprings with which culture we intermarry with," they identify the need for conscious rather than unconscious choices. Jung would affirm this call to consciousness while cautioning against reaction formation, rejecting one collective identity only to uncritically embrace another. The journey toward wholeness, both individual and collective, requires neither wholesale acceptance nor wholesale rejection of cultural identity, but conscious relationship with it. This means acknowledging cultural conditioning, recognizing its shadow aspects, and developing the capacity to choose rather than being unconsciously determined. For individuals navigating cross-cultural relationships, it means entering these relationships with eyes open to cultural complexes and the challenges they present. For families negotiating cultural boundaries, it means finding ways to maintain cultural identity without rejecting family members who cross those boundaries. For media creators, it means expanding representations to include the full spectrum of human appearance within each culture. Jung believed that consciousness evolves through the tension of opposites. The painful stories shared here, rejection, colorism, cultural prejudice, contain within them the seeds of new consciousness. By neither denying these realities nor being determined by them, we participate in the evolution of both individual and collective consciousness. The ultimate question is not whether we should preserve cultural boundaries or transcend them, but how we might develop more conscious relationship with the archetypal patterns that shape both individual and collective identity. In that more conscious relationship lies the possibility of both cultural continuity and psychological wholeness, not as opposing forces, but as complementary aspects of an evolving human consciousness. What aspects of your cultural identity have you accepted unconsciously? What parts have you rejected reactively? And where might you develop more conscious relationship with the cultural complexes that shape your sense of self and other? These questions invite us toward the greater consciousness that Jung believed represents humanity's highest calling and greatest hope.